In the spring of 1889, in a dry fold of the Bitterroot Valley in western Montana, a woman of 28 stood at the back of a county land auction and paid $1 for a building the town had already condemned. The auctioneer laughed when her hand went up. So did the men leaning on the rail behind him, because the lot she had bid on was the old Camas Prairie schoolhouse, a square of gray clapboard with a caved porch and a bell tower leaning like a drunk, shut and chained for 11 years and slated to be pulled down for its lumber. She did not laugh with them. She had a reason for that dollar that none of them knew, and it had been waiting 11 years in the dark under that floor. Her name was Della Hart, and she had been thrown out of that valley once, on a cold morning when she was 17, with a carpet bag and a set of clockmaker's tools and nothing else. What she carried back to the auction was the second of those two things. The first she had long since emptied. The tools she still had, every file and bit and tiny brass key of them, wrapped in the same oiled cloth her grandfather had wrapped them in before he died. He had been the only clockmaker the valley ever had, and he had taught her to listen to a mechanism the way other people listen to a sermon, with patience and the certainty that the truth was in there if you were quiet long enough to hear it. There is a kind of person who is dismissed early and never quite forgiven for coming back. Stay with this one a while, because what she found under that schoolhouse was not what anyone expected, least of all the men who had signed the papers that condemned it. The town thought it had buried something. It had only sealed it. The schoolhouse sat at the end of a wagon track 3 miles north of the town of Stockett, on a low rise where the prairie ran up against the first dark line of the pines. It had been built in 1871, with money raised by the families of the prairie, every board of it hauled by ox team from the mill at Sunday River, and for 7 years it had held 24 children through winters that froze the ink in the wells. Then, in the autumn of 1878, it had closed, all at once and without much explanation, and a new schoolhouse had gone up closer to the town the following year. The old building had been left to the weather and the mice, and the valley had agreed, in the way valleys agree on things, not to talk about why Della knew why. She had been 6 years old in that schoolhouse in its last year, and she remembered the teacher, a young woman named Miss Iredale, who had come out from Ohio and who had kept a great iron strong-box in the cellar that the children were forbidden to go near. She remembered the morning Miss Iredale did not come to ring the bell. And she remembered, 11 years later, the thing her grandfather told her on the last night of his life, in a whisper, with his hand closed hard around her wrist, because he had carried it too long and could not carry it into the ground. The men at the auction did not remember any of that, or chose not to. To them, the dollar bid was a joke, a girl throwing away good coin on a ruin she could not even move. The auctioneer, a heavy, florid man named Brunt, made the joke out loud. He said she now owned a building she could not lift, on land she could not sell, and that she was welcome to every splinter of it. The crowd enjoyed that. Della folded the bill of sale into her satchel and said only that she would take the key. Brunt told her there was no key, that the chain had rusted to the hasp years ago, and that if she wanted in, she could bring her own hammer. She said she had brought her own hammer. That stopped the laughing for a moment, though not for long. She walked the 3 miles out alone that afternoon, the satchel on her hip, and the oiled roll of tools heavy against her ribs. The prairie in May was green and moving, the grass running silver where the wind crossed it, the pines ahead almost black against a sky scrubbed clean. The schoolhouse rose slowly out of the rise as she came on, larger than memory had made it and sadder, the paint gone to the color of ash, the windows blind with dust and the boards somebody had nailed across them. The bell tower leaned. The porch had dropped on one side where a post had rotted through. A magpie sat on the ridgeline and watched her come, and did not fly. She stood a long while at the foot of the broken porch and let the building look back at her. There is a thing that happens when you return to a place that hurt you. A doubling where the grown woman stands inside the child and both of them see the door. At once Della felt it and let it pass. Then she set down her satchel, unrolled the oiled cloth on the one sound porch board, and chose from it not a hammer, but a thin steel pick and a small can of oil, because her grandfather had taught her that you do not break what you mean to understand. You open it. The front door was held by a chain looped through 2 iron staples and locked with a padlock the size of her fist. A heavy old warded lock, gone the color of dried blood with rust. Brunt had been right that no key would turn it. He had been wrong that it could not be opened. Della worked oil into the keyway with a feather from her satchel, drop by drop, and waited, and worked in more, and waited again, while the sun moved a hand's width across the boards. She did not hurry. Hurry, her grandfather had said, is how you snap a thing you only meant to persuade. When the oil had gone in as far as it would go, she fitted the pick, and a small tension wrench her own hands had filed down years before, and she felt for the wards the way she had felt for them, as a girl on Loxie sat in front of her at the workbench, blindfolded, until she could see with her fingers. The lock gave on the 3rd try with a soft, heavy click that she felt more than heard. The chain slid free of the staples and pooled on the porch with a sound like a held breath let go. Della stood and worked the feeling back into her cramped fingers and looked at the open dark of the doorway, and the smell of 11 sealed years came out to meet her. Dust, and old chalk and mouse and something mineral underneath it, the cold breath of a cellar that the sun had not touched since before she had grown. What she did not yet know was that the cellar held more than the iron strongbox of her memory. It held the reason a schoolhouse had been closed without a word, and the reason a teacher from Ohio had never come back to ring the bell, and the reason her grandfather had died with his hand around her wrist. All of that was 3 days of labor away, and she did not rush it. She had learned the cost of rushing. The main room was a ruin of a kind that has its own order. The desks were still in their rows under a gray pelt of dust. Smaller than she remembered, the inkwells dry and ringed with rust. A slate hung crooked at the front, and on it, faint under the years, a column of sums in a child's hand that no one had ever wiped clean. Birds had been in through a broken pane high under the eaves, and the floor below it was white with their leavings, and a nest sat in the cold stovepipe like a fist. She walked the room slowly, setting her boots down on the joists where she could feel them solid, because 11 years of damp had turned some of the boards to sponge. At the back, behind the teacher's platform, was the low door to the cellar stair, and it too was chained. She did not open it that first day. The light was going, and her grandfather had taught her never to begin work. She could not finish by daylight, because a thing half opened in the dark invites the hand to slip. She made a camp on the soundboards near the stove, ate bread and a cold boiled egg from the satchel, and slept with the roll of tools under her head and the magpie's small noises in the rafters above her. She had slept in worse places. At 17, she had slept in a livery loft in Helena, for a winter mending watches by lamplight, for men who paid her half what they would have paid a man, and called her clever, the way you call a dog. Clever. There had been a jeweler on Last Chance Gulch, a man named Pelham, with a soft white hand and a hard small mouth, who had let her work a bench in the back of his shop because she was fast and because she was cheap, and who had once held a repaired hunting watch up to the window light, turned it over, found no fault in it, and said it was good work for a girl and docked her 2 bits anyway for the lamp oil she had burned. She had not argued. Arguing was a thing you did when you had somewhere else to go. She had taken the coin and gone back to the loft and slept in her coat with the tools under her head, and in the morning she had been at the bench before he turned the key, because the surest answer to a man who thinks you are nothing is to be twice as good as he is and never tell him so. She had saved that half. She had saved it for 11 years. $1 of it had bought this ruin, the rest was folded flat in a money belt against her skin, and what it was for she had not told a living soul. Morning came gray, and then gold across the prairie, and she rose stiff and went to the cellar door. The chain here was newer than the one on the front, and that was the first thing that was wrong. Everything in the building had aged 11 years at the same rate. The paint, the wood, the iron of the front padlock, all gone to the same rust and ash. The cellar chain, though, was lighter, its links still mostly black. The padlock on it, a brass-bodied lock of a make she knew well, because her grandfather had sold that very make from his shop. Somebody had chained the cellar shut after the building was already closed. Somebody had come back, once with a good lock, and sealed the stair and gone away again. Della crouched at the little door with the brass lock cold in her palm, and felt the old patience go very deep and still in her. She did not force it. She studied the shackle, the wear on the brass, the way the dust had settled, and then been disturbed and then settled again, and she read in it the plain fact that no one had opened this lock in a very long time, but that it had not always been here. Then she oiled it and waited, and picked it, slower than the first because a good lock asks for respect. It took her the better part of an hour. When it opened, she did not go down at once. She sat on the top step with the door swung wide, and let the cellar's long-sealed air rise past her into the morning, cold and faintly sweet, with the smell of paper and iron and time, and she let her eyes find the dark before she trusted her feet to it. The stair was sound, cut from heavy fir and set on stone, and it went down 12 steps into a cellar larger than the room above had promised, a stone-walled, cool dark that the prairie heat never reached. Her grandfather's tools had taught her to bring her own light and her own time, and she had both. She lit the small lantern from her satchel and went down into the held breath of 11 years, and the lantern light swung across the walls and found against the far wall, exactly where the 6-year-old in her had always known it would be, the great iron strong-box of Miss Iredale. And it was the size of a hay trunk, black iron banded with heavier iron, set on a low platform of brick to keep it off the cellar damp, and it had not rusted the way everything above had rusted because the cellar was dry and cold and still. On its face was a lock, unlike the padlocks above, a lock built into the body of the box itself, a maker's lock, the kind that is part of the iron and cannot be cut away without destroying what it guards. Della set the lantern on a stone shelf and knelt in front of the box, on the cold brick, and put both her hands flat against the iron, and it was like putting her hands against the chest of something very old that had been holding its breath for a long time. Here is the part the men at the auction would never have believed, and you who are listening may keep it in mind through the 3 days that follow. The lock on that box was a heart lock. Her grandfather's mark was struck into the brass escutcheon, a small running hair, the pun he had made of his own name and stamped on every mechanism he ever built. He had made this lock. He had made it, and set it into this box, in this cellar, in the last year before the school closed, and he had never once in 11 years spoken of it until the night he died. She knew his locks the way she knew his hands, and she knew, kneeling there, that he had built it to be opened by exactly one person, and that the person was meant to be her. A heart lock does not yield to picking. Her grandfather despised the pick as a thief's apology, and built his best locks to laugh at it. What his locks yielded to was knowledge, a sequence, a thing you had to know rather than feel, and he had built into each of them a logic that a stranger could work at for a year and never find, but that anyone he had taught would recognize like a face. Della sat back on her heels in the lantern light and closed her eyes and went looking in her memory for the lessons of a dead man, because the key to the box was not iron. It was everything he had ever taught her, and he had taught her. She understood now for this. She worked the box for the rest of that day and got nowhere, and that was as he had intended. The face of the lock showed 4 small brass wheels, each milled with the figures 1 through 12 like the hours of a clock, and below them a single keyhole that took no key she had. 12 to the 4th power is a great many combinations, more than a patient woman could try in a season, and her grandfather had not built a lock to be brute forced by patience alone. He had built it to be answered. The wheels were hours. The question was, which 4 hours, and in what order? And the answer was somewhere in the things he had said to her across a workbench for the 11 years she had been alive before he died. She slept that second night in the cellar beside the box, which she would not have done in any haunted place, because she did not believe the cellar was haunted. She believed it was sealed, and that there is a difference, and that the difference was the whole of her grandfather's teaching. In the morning she climbed back up into the light and walked the schoolhouse again, not as a ruin now, but as a message, because a man who hides a thing leaves the way to it nearby for the one he trusts. She read the room. She read the crooked slate with its column of unwiped sums. She read the dry inkwells and the small desks and the dropped porch. And at the front of the room, above the door, where every schoolhouse in the territory had hung one, she found the clock. It was a plain octagonal schoolhouse clock, in a case of dark oak, stopped, its glass furred with dust, its hands fallen still at some hour 11 years gone. Della took it down from its nail with both hands, gently, the way you take down something that has been waiting, and she carried it to the window light and wiped the glass with her sleeve, and looked at the face. The hour the hands had stopped at was not random. Nothing her grandfather touched was ever random. She turned the case over and found, struck into the brass of the movement, the running hair, he had made the schoolhouse clock too. Of course he had made the clock and the lock, and he had stopped the one to tell her the other. She did not yet have all 4 numbers. The stopped clock gave her 1 hour, the hour the hands had fallen to, and she trusted it the way she trusted his voice. For the other 3 she went back into her memory, into the long patient evenings at the workbench, and she remembered a thing he used to say when he set a watch right, that a clock keeps 3 kinds of time, the hour you read, the hour you wind, and the hour you set, and that a man who knew all 3 knew the whole of a day. She had thought it was only his way of talking. Kneeling again before the box that 3rd morning, she understood it was an instruction he had left, in plain sight for a child who would one day be grown enough to need it. The hour the clock had stopped at, the hour he had always wound it, every evening of her childhood, at the close of the shop, the hour the school had always set its day to begin, the hour Miss Iredale rang the bell. 3 hours. She knew the way she knew her own name. And the 4th, the last wheel, she sat with for a long time in the cold, until she remembered the only hour her grandfather had ever called sacred, the hour her mother had died bringing her into the world, the hour he had stood at the window every year of her life with his hat in his hands. 4 hours. 4 wheels. She turned them with hands that did not shake because he had not taught her hands to shake. The 4th wheel clicked home, and something deep in the body of the box let go, a heavy iron certainty sliding back along its bed, a sound that came up through the brick and into her knees. She knelt very still and did not lift the lid at once. She had earned the box across 3 days and 11 years, and she knew that the thing inside it had been put there by a man who loved her and feared something, and that the lid, once raised, could not be lowered again on whatever the valley had agreed not to speak of. Then she set her fingers under the iron lip and lifted, and the long-sealed air of the strong box came up cold into her face, and the lantern light went down into it and found what her grandfather had hidden. There were papers. There is always something disappointing, at first, about papers, when the heart has been braced for treasure, and then there is the slow turning when you understand that papers are the only treasure that can undo a wrong. On the top lay a letter in a woman's hand, addressed to no one, and beneath it a thick sheaf of deeds and survey maps and a ledger bound in green cloth, and beneath those, wrapped in flannel, a child's reader and a tin of dried-out watercolors and a single small shoe. Della lifted the letter first and read it kneeling, by the lantern, while the cellar held its cold around her, and as she read it, the closed history of the Camas Prairie Schoolhouse opened in her hands like a lock. The letter was from Miss Iredale. She had written it in the autumn of 1878, in the last week, before she vanished, and she had given it and the contents of the box into the keeping of the only man in the valley she trusted, the clockmaker who fixed the school's clock and asked no questions and missed nothing. What she had discovered, and could not prove alone, and was afraid to carry to any office in the territory, was a theft. The land the Prairie families had built their school on, and the wider sections around it that 20 families farmed, had been surveyed and patented under their names in the early 70s. A land agent, working out of the county seat, a man, the letter named plainly, had refiled those patents through a chain of paper that erased the family's claims and gathered the sections quietly under a holding company he controlled. Against the day the railroad would come through, and the land would be worth 100 times what those families had bled for it. Miss Iredale had found it because the schoolhouse deed was the smallest and most overlooked thread of the theft, and because she kept the school's records, and because she had noticed that the deed the county center did not match the deed the families had signed. She had begun to pull the thread. The ledger in the green cloth was her work, 3 years of it, a patient accounting of every patent altered and every signature forged, and every dollar moved, kept in a schoolteacher's small, exact hand. It was the kind of evidence no accusation could be because it did not accuse. It simply showed, line by line, in figures anyone could check against the county's own books, that a man had stolen a valley with a pen. And then she had gone too close, and the land agent had learned she was pulling his thread, and Miss Iredale had understood that a young schoolteacher alone could be made to disappear, or be discredited, or simply be disbelieved, and that her 3 years of work would be burned the day they found it. So she had done the only thing she could. She had given the whole of it to the clockmaker, and she had left the valley in the night to draw the danger away from the box, meaning to come back for it when she had found a lawyer in the East who would take it up. She never came back. The letter did not say what became of her, and Della, reading, understood that this was a grief with no bottom, and set it gently aside to be felt later, because there was work yet to do, and the dead are best served by the living, finishing what they started. Her grandfather had kept the box. He had built a lock into it that no thief could open and that only his granddaughter could answer, and he had stopped a clock to point the way. And then he had waited, because to bring the ledger forward in his own lifetime was to put a target on his back and on the child he was raising. He was an old man with a granddaughter and no power, and the land agent was a young man with a holding company and the ear of the county. So he had done the patient thing, the clockmaker's thing. He had sealed the truth in iron and set it to be opened by a time that had not yet come, and he had taught a 6-year-old girl, evening by evening, the very knowledge she would need to open it without ever telling her what it was for. On the last night of his life he had told her only this, that there was a box under the old schoolhouse, that it was hers, that she would know how to open it when she was ready, and that what was inside belonged to the families of the prairie and not to her. Then he had closed his hand around her wrist and died. And the next morning, because she was 17 and friendless, and the man who took her in had no use for a girl who would not be told what to do, she had been thrown out of the valley with a carpetbag and a roll of tools. She had carried it 11 years. Now she knelt in the cellar, with the ledger in her hands and the lantern burning low, and understood the whole shape of what her grandfather had built, which was not a vault but a clock, a mechanism set to strike at the right hour, and she was the hour. She climbed up out of the cellar into the last of the daylight with the green ledger wrapped in her shawl against her chest, and she stood on the broken porch and looked out across the prairie at the land the ledger could give back, and she did not feel triumph. She felt the cold, clean weight of a thing that has to be done correctly, or not at all. The land agent named in the letter was still in the valley. That was the part Della had not let herself hope for, and now had to reckon with. His name was Calvin Roque, and in the 11 years since Miss Iredale vanished, he had become exactly what the patient theft was meant to make him: a man of substance in the county seat, a director of the new bank, the holder through his quiet company of a great many sections of prairie that the railroad survey had indeed at last begun to cross. He was past 50 now, gray and unhurried and courteous, the kind of man who is never rude because rudeness is a tool he has never needed. He did not know the box existed. He had assumed for 11 years that whatever the schoolteacher had been assembling had gone into the ground with her, and he had slept well. Della did not go to him. She had her grandfather's word in her ear that what was in the box belonged to the families and not to her, and she understood that to confront Roque was to make the truth about herself. A private quarrel he could meet with his own kind of patience, his lawyers and his bank and his good name against a girl with a ledger and a story. The clockmaker had not built his lock to be a weapon she could swing. He had built it to be evidence anyone could read. So she did the slow thing, the right thing, the thing that took the rest of that summer. She found the families. Some had given up and moved on, but many were still on the prairie, still farming sections they believed they owned free and clear, not knowing that the patents in the county vault had been quietly altered, so that the holding company could foreclose the day the land became valuable. She found the old men first, the ones who had signed the original patents in the 70s and could swear to their own hands. She found a man named Olson gone white and bent on a 40-acre place east of the schoolhouse, where he was setting a fence post in ground too hard for a man his age. She waited at the wire until he was done, because you do not interrupt a man's work to tell him he has been robbed, and then she unwrapped the ledger on the tailgate of his wagon and turned to the page with his name on it. He put on a pair of spectacles, mended at the hinge with wire, and read the lines slowly, his lips moving, and she watched him come to the signature that was meant to be his and was not. The loops too even, the hand too schooled, a forger's careful copy of a farmer's rough mark. He took the spectacles off. He looked out across the 40 acres he had broken with his own back 30 years before, and had spent the last 10 years afraid he would lose to a bank he did not understand. He wept the way old men weep without sound, the water just standing in the seams of his face. Then he asked her, in a voice gone thick, whether it was true that the land had been his the whole while. It had, she told him. It had never stopped being his. They had only taken the paper. He nodded a long time at that, as though it were a sum he was checking, and then he folded her hand in both of his, which were like dry roots, and did not say thank you, because some debts are past the reach of the word, and she was glad of that because she had not come for thanks. She found the Pruitt sisters, who had buried a father who died believing he had failed to hold the land he had in fact never lost. She found, one by one, the wronged, and she did not make speeches to them. She showed them the ledger, and let the figures do what figures do. There was an old woman in Stockett, a midwife named Esther Cobb, who had been in the valley longer than anyone, and it was she who supplied the human memory. The ledger could not. She remembered Miss Iredale. She remembered the autumn, the school closed. She remembered that the young teacher had come to her once, frightened, asking whether the midwife knew a lawyer who could be trusted in Helena, and that a week later she was gone, and that the valley had been told she had run off with a railroad man, a story Esther had never believed because she had seen the teacher's face, and it had not been the face of a woman in love, but of a woman afraid. Esther Cobb took the ledger in her old hands and turned the pages and said, in a voice gone quiet but firm, that she would say all of it to any court in the territory and dare them to call her a liar at her age. She became the witness the paper needed, the living mouth beside the silent ledger. Through that summer, Della worked as her grandfather had taught her, methodically, without heat, building the case the way you build a movement. Every wheel meshed with the next. She had copies made of the ledger and the deeds by a clerk in Helena. She paid out of the money belt she had carried for 11 years, the wages of a girl who mended watches for half a man's pay, and saved every cent of the half. She wrote in her own plain hand an accounting that laid the ledger's figures against the county's own filed patents, so that any honest reader could see where the one had been altered from the other. And she found at last the lawyer Miss Iredale had died, looking for a careful, sober man in the territorial capital, who read the ledger through twice without speaking and then asked her quietly where this had been for 11 years. In a clock, she told him. He did not understand, and she did not explain, and he took the case. The undoing of Calvin Roque did not happen in a single dramatic hour, and Della never once stood in a room with him and named what he had done. It happened the way his theft had happened, slowly on paper. In offices, except in reverse, the altered patents were set beside the originals. The families produced. The ledger's accounting matched the county's own records, line for line, and the holding company's chain of paper, which had been built to look like legitimate purchase, came apart the moment anyone laid the true deeds against it. A territorial court appointed a referee to examine the patents. The bank, learning what its director had built his fortune upon, moved with the Speed Bank's reserve for protecting themselves, and Roque found his good name dissolving from underneath him like brick set on sand. He was not shot. He was not confronted. He was simply, at the end, irrelevant. A man whose foundation of falsified paper had been quietly shown to be exactly that, undone by the weight of what an old clockmaker had sealed in iron and a young woman had brought back into the light. What mattered to Della was not Roque. It was the giving back, and that took longer than the case and was the only part of the work she counted as her own. As the patents were corrected one family at a time, she carried the news herself, out across the prairie, in person, to each door, because her grandfather had said the truth belonged to them and a thing that belongs to someone should be put into their hands and not mailed. She gave Olson back his 40 acres and stayed for supper, and did not let him thank her overmuch. She told the Pruitt sisters that their father had not failed, that he had been robbed, and that the robbery was now undone, and she watched something straighten in their faces that had been bent for a decade. She kept nothing of the land for herself. She had been left $1 worth of condemned schoolhouse and a box that was never hers, and she gave the contents of the box to the people it belonged to and asked for none of it. She did keep the schoolhouse. It was hers, bought fair for $1 and laughed at. And when the land was restored, the families of the prairie came together, the way they had come together in 1871, and they did not pull it down for its lumber. They mended the porch and braced the bell tower and replaced the broken pane and swept 11 years of dust and birds out of the main room, and they opened it again as a school, because the children of the new generation had outgrown the building nearer town. Della did not ask them to. She had not done any of it to be thanked or to be given a place. Yet when the work was done, the families asked her to stay and keep the building, not as the teacher, for she was no scholar, but as the one who kept it sound, who wound the clock and mended what wore and kept the cellar dry, and she said yes, because it was honest work with her hands, and it was the place her grandfather had hidden the truth and trusted her to find it. The auctioneer Brunt, who had laughed loudest, did not apologize, because men like Brunt do not, but he tipped his hat to her once on the street in Stockett the following spring, and did not make a joke, and that was as near to coming around as he had in him, and it was enough. The valley that had thrown her out at 17 did not throw itself at her feet at 29, and she would not have wanted it to. It simply made room for her, quietly, the way a valley does, and let her become the woman who kept the schoolhouse, and after a few years most people forgot she had ever been the girl who was sent away, which suited her, because she had not come back to be remembered as that girl. She had come back to finish a thing. She hung her grandfather's schoolhouse clock back above the door, the one he had stopped to tell her the hour. She cleaned the movement and oiled it with the same oil she had used on the locks, and set it going again, and she set it to the right time, the true time, and after 11 years of silence it kept the hours over the children's heads the way it had been built to. She never told them about the box. The great iron strong-box stayed in the cellar, empty, now its heart lock standing open, and most of the children who clattered down the stair to fetch coal never knew what it was, or whose hand had built the lock, or what had once been sealed inside it against the patience of a thief. Della knew, though. On winter evenings, after the children had gone home, she would sometimes go down the 12 steps with the lantern and sit on the cold brick in front of the open box, and she would take out the roll of her grandfather's tools and lay them across her knees, the files and the bits and the small brass key of him, and she would not work at anything. She would only sit a while in the dry, cool dark, where the truth had waited, and listen to the clock keeping time in the room above, and let the patience he had taught her run very deep and still. He had hidden a valley's worth of justice in a box and set it to strike. When she was ready, and she had been ready, and the hour had come, and it had struck. The running hair was struck into the brass of the open lock, small and worn, his pun on his own name, his mark on every honest thing he ever made. She would put her thumb against it in the lantern light before she climbed back up to bank the stove and lock the door. Then she would go up the 12 steps into the warm dark of the schoolhouse, the clock ticking steady above the empty desks, and she would leave the box open behind her, because there was nothing left in it that needed keeping, and nothing left in the valley that needed to be sealed. Outside, the prairie ran on under the stars toward the black line of the pines, the same prairie the families had built on and bled for, and very nearly lost, restored now to the hands that had earned it, and the bell in the mended tower waited for morning. The girl who had been thrown out with a carpet bag and a roll of tools had bought a condemned schoolhouse for $1, and a town had laughed. She had not laughed back. She had only opened what was sealed and given back what was stolen and stayed to win the clock. What do you suppose your own grandfather sealed away for you, trusting you would one day be patient enough to find it? If a story of a quiet woman and the thing the world threw away has stayed with you this long, there is another like it waiting, and the prairie is wide.